Hi, I'm Joe Stark, creator of the fantasy adventure series The Unscarred. If you like what you hear today, be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Now, on to the show.
On the world of Faereyas, a god made flesh is born every 500 years. These beings are known as the Chosen, but the world will come to call one of them the Unscarred. The Unscarred, written by Joe Stark.
Chapter 15. The Maze. The tunnel felt endless. The sounds of their footfalls echoed down the corridor as the party walked in silence. The space was slightly taller than Kaluka's massive height and roughly similar in width. Hawk had multiplied her light spell to illuminate the tunnel. One of the orbs hung overhead, one trailed behind, and another lit the way ahead. They had yet to encounter any shadow assassins in the tunnel. Whether they were being kept at bay by the light or waiting in ambush somewhere ahead, Eric felt it was only a matter of time before they again encountered the dark specters. So far, Quintus had been able to remain a step ahead of them, anticipating their moves. Eric wasn't so foolish as to believe they had seen the last of the old Shadow Mage's traps. Hawk's orbs slowly bobbed along, keeping pace with the party. They followed fresh footprints through the centuries of accumulated dust, evidence of the Elder's passage as he made his way toward Faldor's tomb. Faldor, the last wizard king of the Ka, had walked these very halls over 3,000 years before. Karasin was his city. It was written that the city had been powered by a wellspring of raw magical energy from the very roots of the great mountain range, a wonder never before seen in the first age of Faereyas. In his final campaign on the southern continent, during the Battle of Faerok, Faldor had battled against Kairos, a master chaos mage who sought to overtake Faerra and the rest of the northern continent. Kairos had amplified his power with a piece of crystallized magic, a relic from the dawn of creation. It had taken an army of slaves excavating a great open-mine pit to find the ancient crystal buried deep within the continental crust. Kairos used his chaos magic to shape the crystal into a multifaceted gemstone. Affixing it to his crown, he was able to focus his spellcraft through the gem, increasing his powers to heights he'd never dreamt possible. But with the magic now absent from its place deep beneath the ground, the landscape turned desolate. Intoxicated by his power and intent on plundering for resources, Kairos had invaded the northern continent, setting off a war that lasted a generation before ending with the Chaos Mage's death at the hands of the Ka Wizard King himself. In the final blow, Faldor cleaved Kairos's head, shattering the gemstone that rested within his crown. As it exploded, Faldor's body was pierced by shards of the corrupted stone. By the time he had returned to Karasin, Faldor felt his psyche beginning to show signs of the tainted magic. Fearing for his people should he succumb to the darkness building inside of him, Faldor entombed himself within Karasin and bade his people to abandon the city. Hawk used her foot to clear away dust from a portion of the tiled stone floor, revealing a metallic conduit that ran parallel to the center of the tunnel. She knelt and hovered her hand over the conduit before placing it directly against the metal surface. Dead, she mumbled to herself. "Eric, would you try something for me?" asked Hawk. "I'd like you to touch this metal here and then focus your will to push power through your palm and into the conduit." The young chosen knelt and placed his hand upon the metal surface. It was cold to the touch. He furrowed his brow in concentration and pictured his body within his mind's eye. He imagined his magical energy as a scintillating white-hot light. It coursed along his muscle fibers and crackled between the synapses in his brain. He willed the energy to flow through his arm and out of his palm where it made contact with the conduit. The metal warmed as it accepted the energy. The stone tiles of the floor, ceiling, and walls began to glow, softly at first, then building in intensity until the tunnel was filled with light, illuminating their path ahead. "The engineering is incredible," said Peary, running his hand along the glowing stone surface. "Who knows what other marvels this place may hold," whispered Hawk, sharing Peary's sense of wonder at the ancient technology. "Or what horrors," added Kaluka darkly. Hawk stared down the length of the tunnel. It stretched into the distance beyond the party in a straight line, terminating in a narrowing nexus of perspective due to the limits of their eyesight. Hawk whispered a quiet incantation and her vision enhanced, but no matter how far she peered down the length of the tunnel, the picture never changed. The passageway was impossibly long and straight. They continued to press forward, walking in single file and keeping space between each other, giving room to maneuver should they fall under attack. Eric led the way, and Hawk, Hoke, and Peary followed behind, with Kaluka bringing up the rear. Hawk felt a sudden disorientation as the ground seemed to lurch beneath her feet. She stumbled forward and caught her balance. Looking around, she found herself not only alone, but the tunnel had also changed. The stone tiles continued to glow, illuminating the confined space, but the passageway was now much larger, perhaps 20 feet in height by width. Looking into the distance of the tunnel, Hawk noticed that it curved to the right. She turned around and looked in the opposite direction. It curved left, indicating that the passageway was circular in shape. "Hoke," she shouted through the room within her mind. "Hawk, where are you?" asked Hoke. "I don't know," replied Hawk. "I'm alone in a large corridor of some kind. Where are you?" asked Hawk. "Same situation here," said Hoke. One of the light orbs bobbed gently in the air next to Hawk. "Well, I guess I'm not completely alone here," said Hawk as she looked at the orb with a curious expression. "Hoke, can you see any of my light orbs?" "No, why?" replied Hoke. Hawk considered the presence of the orb. She surmised it to be the one that had been closest to her when she was with the group, and now it was with her still in this new passageway. But there were two other orbs. One had preceded Eric, and the other had followed Kaluka. So it stood to reason that wherever Eric and Kaluka were located, so were the orbs. "Hoke, if it's safe, just stay where you are. I have an idea," said Hawk. She reached out toward the orb with her mind. It gently floated to her outstretched hand and landed in her palm. She spoke a long series of incantations and then tossed the orb into the air where it began to spin erratically. It jolted and lurched, spitting sparks as it chaotically bucked about. It suddenly split into 3 smaller spheres of light. 2 of them raced off in either direction, disappearing around the bends in the passageway. The spells she'd cast on the orb had commanded it to explore the passageways and split apart to take all paths if it encountered any intersections. Further, the spell also affected the orbs with Eric and Kaluka. Hawk followed the paths of the orbs with her mind and smiled as a map of the tunnel's layout began to take shape. Hawk watched the map grow and quickly ascertained that they were in a circular maze. The picture was far from complete, but she could see that the maze was gigantic in scale. The passageways stretched for miles. As the map continued to take shape in her mind, Hawk felt confident that they would find their way to the center. The others were nearby, though one was much closer than the other. Hawk considered the situation. Her map was no good to others if she couldn't communicate with them. She again pulled the floating light orb into her palm and began to speak another series of incantations. Eric stood alone in the curved passageway. He watched as the orb of light before him began to spin fitfully. It suddenly split into 3 smaller spheres of light. They hung in the air, spinning for just a moment before 2 of the orbs suddenly streaked away in either direction down the passageway. "Well, that was strange," said the young chosen. Eric looked back and forth down the corridor. Filled with indecision, he sat with his back against the wall and considered his next move. The remaining light orb hung motionless before him. Eric glanced at the luminous sphere. "Which way do you think I should go?" he asked the orb. "Listen closely," responded the orb. The young chosen cocked his head to the side as he stared in bewilderment at the ball of light. The orb had spoken in Hawk's voice. "Hawk!" exclaimed Eric. "Are you all right? Where is everybody?" "We're in a maze," replied Hawk, her voice emanating from the floating orb. I'm using the orbs to map the corridors, but it's slow going. This place is humongous. I can see large areas around you, me, and Kaluka, and none of them have yet to overlap. Kaluka is further away, but you're close enough that I can guide you to me." Eric stood. The light orb gently bobbed up and down as it floated in the air. "Face the outside of the curve, then turn right and walk down that corridor until you come to an intersection with a right turn." Eric followed the directions to the intersection. "Now go right and continue on until the corridor again turns right," instructed Hawk as she watched his progress along the map in her mind. "I'm just on the other side of the wall to your left," said Hawk. "It'll be a twisty route, but it shouldn't take too long to work your way around." Eric stopped. "How thick are the walls?" asked the young chosen. Hawk directed her light orbs to hug either side of the stone-tiled wall. "Approximately 3 feet," she answered. "Why?" A booming cadence sounded through the wall as dust shook loose from the ceiling. Cracks began to form across the tiled facade. The tumultuous onslaught increased in ferocity, and Hawk conjured a protective shield around her body. Suddenly the wall before her gave way, bursting outward in a hailstorm of stones and dust. Hawk spoke another incantation, and the floating dust swirled and coalesced into a small pile on the floor. Eric scrambled through the hole, stepping around large blocks of broken stone. He wore a self-satisfied smile as he brushed dust from his hair and clothing. Hawk dropped her protective spell and fixed Eric with a disapproving glare as she wordlessly motioned toward the mess of stone littering the floor between them. Eric began to retort, but stopped short as the broken stones began to vibrate and pull together around his feet. He stepped away and watched. The blocks rumbled and rolled, the gravel skittered, and the dust snaked along in long lines, all being drawn across the floor into a single mass. The stones took on a humanoid shape, headless with stocky legs and thick arms. The golem rose up to its full height, its joints crunching and grinding as it moved. Even without a head atop its broad shoulders, it towered over the young chosen. The golem lurched forward, swinging a jagged arm at Eric. He dodged a slow-moving strike and then closed the distance, unleashing a thunderous blow against the creature's craggy midsection. The golem shattered into pieces, crashing against the damaged wall and breaking loose more stones that clattered to the floor in a rain of dust and gravel. "Not good," shouted Hawk. Once again the stones pulled together and the golem rose anew, now larger with the additional rubble added to its mass. "Aw, shit," grumbled Eric. He again leapt forward and peppered the giant creature with blows, taking care to avoid further damaging the wall. "Stand back," commanded Hawk. Eric jumped aside and felt the tingle of magic as Hawk's spell raced past him. It hit the golem and exploded in a shower of sparks. Energy crackled and arced between the space between the sparks, forming a net that pulled tight around the stone creature. The net constricted, and with a great grinding rattle, the golem was crushed into a large boulder. "Nice work," said Eric. "That was quick thinking." Hawk grabbed Eric's sleeve and pulled as she turned to run. "Sing my praises later. That spell won't hold it for long." Eric glanced backward. Already the mass of stone was spilling pebbles and sand through the gaps in the net. The pair ran down the corridor, their boots thundering against the tile floor. Hawk led the way, her hands still tightly grasping Eric's sleeve as she navigated them away from the golem. She felt a floor tile give way beneath her foot and her vision swirled. With a small flash of light, the pair vanished. The energy net blinked and disappeared, and the golem rose to its feet. It shuffled back toward the broken wall. Reaching the damaged section, the creature crawled into the hole, its body shifting and changing shape to fill the void left by Eric's passage. With a final grinding and swirling of dust, the wall reformed, leaving its surface once again smooth and unmarked. Peary stared at the dead end and shouted in frustration. After being separated from the rest of the party, he had appeared in a long, gently curving corridor. Deciding that one way was as good as the other, he cautiously set off down the passageway, keeping the outside of the curve to his left. He hadn't gone far when he sensed the presence of magic, but too late. A stone tile gave way under his foot, and he felt a brief sensation of falling before finding himself facing a dead end. Peary turned around. The corridor ran along the same curved path before him, but terminated in a wall at a right turn 30 feet ahead. Peary considered his circumstances. A false tile within the floor had activated a spell that jumped him to another place. He counted himself lucky. Had the spell been lethal in nature, he'd likely be dead. He would need to be careful going forward. Keeping to the center of the passageway, Peary stalked forward, carefully stepping from tile to tile. Progress was slow going as he hovered his foot before each new tile, extending his senses and searching for any signature of spellcraft before making contact with the stone floor. Once again he felt as though he were falling, but immediately found himself facing a dead end. He hesitantly turned around. The same 30 feet of corridor stretched before him. Peary hugged the right wall and tried again, but soon found himself facing the familiar stone wall of the corridor's dead end. He next tried the left wall, but reached the same result. He was trapped. Maybe it is a lethal spell, thought Peary. If it keeps me trapped here, it's only a matter of time. Pushing aside intrusive thoughts of death by starvation, Peary focused on the task before him. He cleared his mind and took a deep breath as he brought his palms together before his chest, his fingers splayed out with 3 of the digits overlapping one another. He opened his mouth and began a repetitive chant. Reaching the end of the refrain, he began the chant anew. Pressure built between his palms and a field of energy enveloped the Ka mage. It was the first spell he had learned as a child at Ander's knee, the 7-fingered hands. The spell was a simple yet powerful ward against magical attacks. The 7-fingered hands would encase him within a shroud of disruptive energy so long as he maintained the hand sign and continued the chant. Once either was stopped, the protective field would drop. Peary hoped it would be equally effective at nullifying the spellcraft woven into the floor tiles, at least long enough to allow him to pass. He carefully stepped forward, splitting his focus between walking and continuing to chant as he kept his hands tightly aligned before his chest. A tile moved under his left foot, but Peary was unaffected by the triggered jump spell, protected by the 7-fingered hand. He pushed his momentary elation aside and silently thanked Ander, and pressed forward. Hoke sat with his back against a wall, waiting for Hawk's light orbs to map the layout of the maze around him. A small platter with a half-consumed chicken lay across his knees. He closed his eyes and savored the taste of the tender meat. He wasn't sure when he would next be able to eat, so he took advantage when he could. Movement from Hoke's right drew his attention. He readied his body to snap into violent action, but relaxed as he recognized Peary's gait. As the Ka mage drew closer, Hoke saw that he was chanting and holding a hand sign. Spellcraft, Hoke thought to himself. Peary paced the area around Hoke as though he were a performer in a parade or a soldier walking post. The Farron absent-mindedly chewed his meal as he watched the spectacle with a bemused expression on his face. Peary fell silent and dropped his arms. He shook out his hands as he fixed Hoke with a curious expression. "What is that? Are you eating chicken?" asked the Ka mage. "Yeah, mate," said Hoke, holding out the small platter. "Want any?" Peary shook his head. "I'm good, thanks." "You're lost," said Hoke. He shrugged and wiped his fingers and face with a small towel before stowing the platter in his satchel. Standing up, he stretched as he listened to Peary relay his encounter with the jump tiles. Hoke nodded. "Hawk described a similar experience happening to her and Eric," said Hoke. "She also mentioned that we should avoid damaging the walls unless we want to battle an unstoppable golem construct thing." "Perhaps Kaluka was right. What horrors indeed," remarked Peary. Hoke laughed. "You have no idea, mate." The Ka's eyes suddenly widened in shock. "If we're here, and Eric and Hawk are together somewhere else, where's Kaluka?" asked Peary. "Hawk is guiding him through," replied Hoke. Peary raised an eyebrow, but further conversation was interrupted as an orb of light streaked to a stop before them. It jogged and cantered in the air before splitting in two. The duplicate streaked off down the corridor, continuing the orb's original path. The remaining ball of light gently bobbed up and down before the pair. Finally," said Hawk, her voice issuing from the orb. Peary's eyes again widened in shock. "I'm glad you two are together, Peary. That'll make this easier," said Hawk. "This place is a big circular maze, but now that I've found you two, I have enough of the layout mapped to lead us all toward a rendezvous near the center. Hoke will be able to guide you both through. You already know about the jump tiles. Eric tells me that your 7-fingered hand technique will also protect Hoke from them if he keeps a hand on your shoulder. There doesn't seem to be any more jump tiles once you make it past the outermost ring of the maze, so you shouldn't have to keep it up for long," she said, summarizing their situation. Peary silently stared at the floating orb as he took in Hawk's words. He glanced at Hoke. "All right, then. Which way?" Hoke smiled as he shouldered his pack. "Down that way," he said, motioning with a nod of his head. "Third left, then the first right." Peary raised his hands into the sign for the 7-fingered hand, but stopped short. I'm sorry you were stabbed, but I'm sure glad Hawk's with us. She seems to have this all in hand, said the Ka mage. Hoke laughed. Yeah, Hawk's a problem solver. Whoever built this maze met their match when she was dropped in. Piri smiled and activated his spell, leading Hoke down the corridor, deeper into the ancient maze. Kaluka stood motionless, silently observing a pair of shadow assassins. Since being separated from the rest of the party, he had been surrounded by the creatures. He surmised that this was the same place that Quintus had been dropped into the maze, and the old shadow mage had left the creatures to guard his path. He was thankful for his black mantis armor, as it seemed to render him undetectable to the ebon creatures. An orb of light that spoke with Hawk's voice had appeared with both directions and warning, but observation of the assassins had borne unexpected fruit. The shadows were corporeal enough to activate the jump tiles concealed within the floor. By carefully watching the movements of the aimless assassins, Kaluka was able to ascertain the location of the spells and avoid them. He slowly made his way through the maze, following Hawk's guiding voice from the orb of light as it bobbed along next to the Mon Motavi. The shadow assassins recoiled from the light as Kaluka passed them by. "Take this right turn just ahead," said Hawk. Kaluka stopped at the intersection. "It's unnaturally dark," said the Ka, "as though light will not cross into the corridor." The light orb drifted forward and vanished from sight as it crossed into the darkened passageway. "Can you see the orb?" asked Hawk, her voice drifting out of the darkness. "No," replied Kaluka, "but I can hear you. Let's keep moving." He stepped into the blackened corridor and pitched forward. He stumbled but quickly caught his balance. "The floor is uneven," said Kaluka. He slid his right foot forward, feeling the contour of the floor's surface before shifting his weight and repeating the process with his left foot. The floor rose and fell, following no discernible pattern. Kaluka proceeded slowly, carefully sliding his feet across the floor as though he were traversing a frozen mountain lake. Following Hawk's directions, he pressed on. Intrusive thoughts began to fill his mind, wild imaginations of the terrors that could lurk in a place like this. He pushed the images from his mind and focused on his feet. The floor was challenging to navigate in the dark, making it difficult to gauge his progress, but he felt that he was making headway. "Stop," said Hawk, her voice cutting through the oppressive darkness. "You need to take a right at this intersection." Kaluka turned and slid his right foot forward. The floor slanted upward as he slowly advanced, the angle increasing with each small stride forward. On instinct, he stretched out his arms, blindly feeling into the darkness when he touched cold stone. He slid his hands across the smooth surface. It was flat like a wall, but with a base that curved outward to join the uneven floor. "This isn't an intersection," said Kaluka. "It's a wall." Pondered Hawk. "There must be an opening above you." Kaluka leaned forward and stretched his arms upward, feeling for a ledge, but found only more flat stone wall. He inched his feet forward, placing the soles of his boots flat against the curving slope of the lower wall. Pasting his feet against the stone, he locked his feet off below his ankles, isolating them against movement from his upper body as he placed his palms flat against the wall. Inch by inch he made his way up the steepening slab. Once again he stretched his arms upward. His fingers traced the surface of the wall when the resistance suddenly fell away, revealing a flat edge. He'd found it. He gripped the edge with both hands and pulled, giving a final push with his feet as he clambered up and over the darkened ledge. He pushed down with his palms and hoisted his upper body up as he snaked his right foot up and onto the ledge. Shifting his weight onto his right foot, he stepped up and stood. He breathed a sigh of relief. He had been climbing granite slabs since childhood, but never in complete darkness. Kaluka shuffled forward, wary of the fall behind him should he lose his balance in the ebon passageway. Blinding light suddenly assailed him as he emerged from the darkness. He blinked to clear his vision, then surveyed his surroundings. The corridor looked much the same, though the curvature of the walls was slightly tighter, proof that he was moving toward the center of the maze. Taking direction from Hawk, Kaluka again pressed forward. Eric waited while Hawk communicated via her light orb, guiding Kaluka through the ancient maze. They had settled into a routine of traveling in shifts. Wait, walk, repeat. Though he understood the necessity, Eric sighed in frustration over their slow progress. "Sorry," said Hawk as she opened her eyes. "I know this is tedious." Eric shook his head. "It's all right. We'd be hopelessly lost down here without you." Hawk smiled in mock embarrassment at the praise. You'd have figured it out. Eventually, she added with a wink. I don't think I would have, said Eric. Your spellcraft is far beyond what little I learned in the Order, and we've seen how useful it is when I go around punching holes in the walls. No, I'd have been in real trouble without you. Hawk held out her hand. Give me your hand, she said. If you see what I'm seeing, maybe you'll understand it better. Eric took her hand and suddenly found himself in a small room. Wooden doors faced each other from opposite walls, one lined with overladen bookshelves, while the other hosted a narrow bar with an array of crystal bottles and glass tumblers. A small fireplace was centered along the third wall. The remaining wall sported a large curtain but was otherwise blank. In the middle of the small room sat 2 leather chairs. The door set within the bookshelved wall opened and Hawk emerged. Gone was her leather armor, replaced by a light sweater and dark leggings. Her reddish blonde hair was pulled back into a single ponytail. She settled into a chair and motioned for Eric to do the same. Hawk flicked her hand and a steaming cup of tea appeared on the table beside her, filling the air with the aromatic scent of bergamot. Tea? Asked Hawk as Eric took the empty chair opposite the Farron mage. The young chosen looked around the room. This is the place between you and Hoke's mines, said Eric. Yes, replied Hawk. She raised a finger and the curtain pulled open, revealing a window in the center of the blank wall opposite the fireplace. Through the pane of glass, Eric saw himself, or rather his body where it stood in the maze. The view changed as Hawk swept her gaze back and forth to look down the opposing lengths of the corridor stretching away from where they'd left their bodies. Observe, said Hawk. Lights began to take shape in the space between them. It formed into a large map showing the layout of the circular maze. Glowing dots could be seen scattered throughout, Hawk's light orb spells. One of the dots intensified in brightness. Here's Kaluka, said Hawk. Another dot shined brightly. Here's Hoke and Peary, she said. Hawk made a twirling motion with her index finger, and a light orb sprang into being next to Eric, causing a new dot to appear and pulse on the map. And this one is where we are, concluded Hawk. Eric rubbed his chin as he studied the map. Kaluka had made it the furthest into the maze, with Hoke and Peary close behind, but he and Hawk still had much ground to cover. His attention was drawn to the door behind him as Hoke entered the room. Eric began to rise from Hoke's chair when the Farron Ranger motioned for him to remain. It's okay, said Hoke. I just need to verify our location. Eric glanced at the glowing map floating in midair. The dot of light indicating Hoke and Peary's position was stopped before an intersection. Hoke smiled at the seated pair. Meet you in the middle, yeah? Wait, said Eric. Hoke stopped before the door. All right, you've talked me into it, said Hoke. He filled a glass with ice and selected a bottle from the bar as Hawk conjured a third chair with a flick of her hand. Hoke took a seat and poured himself a drink. He took a long pull from the glass and set it on the table beside him. Eric frowned and reached across the table, moving Hoke's glass onto a coaster. Hoke chuckled darkly in the same manner as when Eric had expressed discomfort over the Ka's reverence of the Alik. Oh no, said Hawk with a laugh. You really can't let him know when little things like that bother you. He never forgets. Hoke continued to chuckle as Eric shook his head and laughed. Is it possible to bring Peary and Kaluka here? Asked Eric. Hawk shook her head. Only people I physically touch. She closed her eyes for a moment. I've connected our orbs. We'll be able to speak to each other through them now. Thank you, Hawk, said Eric. Peary? Kaluka? I am here, said Peary. I can hear you, Alik, replied Kaluka. Good. Let's take a moment to share what we've learned so far, said Eric. They discussed their experiences in the maze, and a picture of the ancient tomb's defenses began to take shape. From the tunnel beneath Faldor's statue, they had each been jumped to separate places in the circular maze's outermost ring. Jump tiles hidden within the floor would move them back to the outermost ring, or at worst into a dead end as had happened to Peary. Beyond the jump tiles was a ring of darkness, engineered to lead people back toward the outer rings. They had all made it past the darkness and now waited to see what other traps the maze had in store for them. The Ka Mon Matavi had encountered several of Quintus's shadow assassins, but had discovered that his black mantis armor concealed him, a boon should Hoke and Peary encounter any of the ebon creatures. Eric again rubbed his chin as he studied the map. Our paths all converge in this ring here, he said, pointing to a position near the center of the map. A new dot appeared on the map where he had touched it. He looked at Hawk. Can you make the orbs lead the way to our rendezvous? Asked Eric. Hawk frowned. I've already altered the spell far beyond its original state, said the Farron mage. Her brow furrowed as she thought. Given enough time to study and experiment, it could probably be done, but it would take a while. Longer than we have, anyway. As we linger here, Quintus could even now have made it to Falder's tomb. If he's even still alive, said Hoke. No, said Kaluka. His shadow assassins still linger. He yet lives. Eric took hold of the light orb floating beside him. He touched the rendezvous place on the glowing map and closed his eyes. He focused his will and spoke to the sphere of light as though it were a child. Lead them here, he told the orb, relaying the simple message with his thoughts. The orb gently bobbed up and down in obedience. Upon the map, dots representing Hoke's other light spells began to move toward the center of the maze. I think I did it, said Eric. Hawk shifted her perception and studied the threads of spellcraft running throughout the sphere of light. Her familiar weave had been replaced by patterns she had never seen before. She stood enraptured by the sight as ideas began to percolate in the back of her mind. Incredible, said Hawk in an awestruck voice. Okay, everybody, follow the orbs and stay vigilant, said Eric. Hoke drained the last of his whiskey and set aside his glass. He glanced from Eric to Hawk. Nice work, Eric, said Hoke, pointing to the look of shock that still adorned Hawk's visage. Impressing that one isn't an easy feat to pull off. Eric stood to leave as Hoke's door closed. Wait, said Hawk. How did you do that? Alter my spell, she asked. Eric chuckled through gritted teeth, a slight grimace crossing his features. You said it was possible, so I tried. I spoke to your spell and told it what I wanted. I'm not sure how it worked, though, admitted Eric. Fascinating, said Hawk. It's no wonder that Kalan advanced her understanding of spellcraft by working with Helen, she thought to herself. The magic wielded by the Chosen was advanced beyond comprehension, but with the ability to read the threadwork of the spells, understanding could be gained. Hawk's head spun with the implications of the potential advancements she could make if she worked with Eric. She pointed to the light orb floating between them. You believed your spell would work because I told you it was possible. Mages wield magic by incantation and hand signs, but I think your spellcraft requires two entirely different principles altogether, idea and belief, said Hawk. First the idea, and then the absolute belief that it will work. The young Chosen looked at Hawk and nodded. He considered the truth of her words and vowed to take them to heart. If anyone could help him unravel the mystery of his awesome power, it was the heiress of Kalan. They returned to the corridor. The light orb slowly floated ahead of them down the passageway before stopping and gently bobbing up and down as it waited on the pair to catch up. Looks like it works, said Hawk with a smile. Let's just hope that we don't encounter any more of those darkened corridors. Shit, I didn't think of that, said Eric with a sigh. Hawk laughed. If it comes to that, I'll guide them through. She spoke a brief incantation, and the air in front of them shimmered as though seen through rising waves of heat. No jump tiles have been reported past the darkness, but just in case, that'll nullify any we come across, said Hawk. The pair set off, following the guiding light along the twists and turns, leading them deeper into the depths of the maze. They walked for miles, and still the passageways continued without end. They were nearing the midpoint of their journey to the rendezvous when a clattering sound echoed down the corridor before them. They froze and listened. The repetitive clacking slowly grew in volume. Something was coming toward them. Is that the sound of hooves? Whispered Hawk. Movement could be seen from the intersection ahead as a large figure stepped into view. It was man-shaped with an elk's antlered head. Its torso was heavily muscled, as was its powerful arms, and in each hand it held a short, double-bladed axe. The beast's legs were covered in coarse hair, and it had cloven hooves for feet. It turned its antlered head and fixed its gaze on the pair of intruders. The beast's eyes burned like blazing coals as it bellowed a challenge, its bugling call echoing down the passageway. Eric drew his great blade as the beast charged. He leapt forward to distance the fight away from Hawk. The clang of steel upon steel rang through the corridor as Eric deflected the beast's attack, its axe blades sparking as they carved long furrows through the stone floor. Eric unleashed a powerful front kick to the beast's chest, propelling it backward. It's a construct, shouted Hawk. It won't stop coming at you until we've drained its power. The beast rose to its feet. Even at a distance, it towered over them. It shook its antlered head and again bellowed its bugling call as it stamped its feet in agitation. How do we drain its power? Asked Eric. Hawk shouted an incantation and extended her arm toward the beast, her palm facing outward. The construct was knocked backward as though hit by an invisible fist. The burning light within its eyes flickered, and the beast again shook its head in agitation. Hawk smiled. Just keep hitting it. Excellent, said Eric with a grin. He leapt forward and swung his sword in a wide slash, knocking the beast's battle axes aside with the great blade. The young chosen quickly spun on his left foot and kicked the elk brute in the head, the heavy blow landing across its long jawline and propelling the beast sideways. Hawk shouted another incantation, and a barrier of shimmering light enveloped the walls mere seconds before the creature crashed against it. "Mind the walls!" shouted Hawk. The beast leapt to its feet and turned its burning gaze onto Hawk. It raised its axes as it closed the distance between itself and the Farron mage. Eric burst into action, seeking to intercept the brute, but Hawk quickly retracted her spell from the wall, moving the force field to block the construct's charge. With a word of power, the field began to push the elk beast back. Eric raced forward, his great blade raised and ready to strike. Sounds of battle issued from the light orb. Hoke and Peary froze mid-step. The Farron closed his eyes for a moment. "Hawk and Eric are battling some kind of elk monstrosity," said Hoke. "It's a construct," Hawk's voice shouted from the orb. The whooshing of feathery wings suddenly filled the air, catching them by surprise. Peary dove aside as a spear point stabbed down at him from above. Hoke swiftly drew his sword and blocked a second attack as Peary rolled across the stone floor. The construct beast flapped its great wings and withdrew to the air above them, using the corridor's height to its advantage. It was man-shaped, but with an eagle's legs, wings, and head. It had the arms of a man, but with wings upon its back. It clutched a long spear in its hands as it hovered over them. It gave a loud screech and again swooped down upon the pair. Hoke leapt and swung his sword, blocking the creature's spear, but was unable to counterattack as the feathered beast swiftly withdrew to the air. Peary chanted an incantation and struck outward toward the construct with a series of upraised palm strikes. The spells closed the distance and struck the beast. It screeched and withdrew further into the air, buffeting its massive wings to absorb and nullify the Ka mage's attack. Hoke glanced at Peary. "This thing's really pissing me off," he shouted. "We need a different plan of attack, mate." Peary nodded in agreement, but quickly braced for an attack as the construct again swooped down upon the pair. Kaluka observed the fight from a distance. 7 shadow assassins were engaged in battle with what Hawk had called a construct beast. Like the shadow assassins themselves, it was a creature conjured by magic. From afar it looked like a large man, but with a ram's head sporting large curling horns. It had thick legs and powerful arms, and in each hand it held a broadsword. The beast furiously swung its blades at the assassins, seeking to fend them off as they attacked en masse. It screamed in rage as the shadow's ebon blades bit into its thick hide. Kaluka watched as the burning light within the creature's eyes dimmed under the assassin's onslaught. It shuddered and rallied, casting aside the shadows as it fiercely swung its swords. The edges of the blades glowed with a faint energy, and when they struck the assassins, the creatures shrieked and recoiled in pain. The beast pressed its attack, and the shadows began to fall under the ram's conjured blades. In short order, the assassins were vanquished, and the corridor was blanketed in silence. The construct turned its horned head and caught sight of Kaluka. It screamed a challenge and charged the Monmutavi, its cloven feet clattering across the stone-tiled floor as it picked up speed. Kaluka drew his swords and bellowed in response. Standing his ground, he caught the beast's blade against his own, engaging the ram brute in hand-to-hand combat. Smiling in satisfaction, Kaluka pressed his attack and began to drive the beast back. Eric swung his sword as Hawk's spell pushed the elk beast construct toward him. It caught the blade on an axe head while it swung the other at Eric's exposed midsection. The young chosen ducked the massive blade. Catching himself with an open palm against the stone tile floor, he simultaneously kicked out with both feet, his boots smashing into the brute's chest and crushing it against Hawk's barrier. Hawk grunted in exertion. It took all her effort to hold the spell after feeling the force of Eric's attack. The beast's head rolled to the side as Hawk observed that its eyes had dimmed considerably after taking the vicious double kick from Eric. Eric again jumped forward, landing blow after blow on the elk beast as it was held in place against Hawk's invisible wall. The creature slumped over and Eric reared back, readying to give a finishing strike, when the beast suddenly lashed out with its axes in an underhand blow, slashing Eric across his chest with both heavy blades. The young chosen fell back in a splash of blood, the spray coating Hawk's force field and pooling across the stone tile floor. The eagle beast screeched loudly. Tucking its wings, it dove at Peary, readying its spear to strike the unarmed man. Hoke grabbed the Ka mage by the front of his robes and tossed him aside. He raised his armored forearm and deflected the spear point, its tip harmlessly glancing off the black mantis armor. Hoke spun and swung his sword in an upward arc, catching the eagle construct in its leg and cutting off a taloned foot. The beast screeched and again retreated into the air. Piri swiftly leapt to his feet and chanted another incantation. He flicked his wrist as though cracking an invisible whip. A line of light extended from his hand to the beast's leg where it wrapped around its remaining foot. Piri grabbed the line with his other hand and gave a mighty pull, attempting to yank the winged creature from the air. The eagle buffeted his wings, pulling Piri forward as he struggled to hold the winged devil at bay. Hoke ran to his aid and grabbed hold of the line. Together they pulled, and the eagle beast fell from the air, crashing to the ground in a heap. Hoke darted forward, his sword drawn back and ready to strike. He thrust and drove the tip through the creature's chest. It fell limp and turned to dust. Kaluka laughed. His swords flashed back and forth as he traded blows with the ram brute. The creature was fast and strong, but not enough to penetrate the Ka's defense. Regardless of the futility, the beast followed its design and continued to fight. Kaluka increased the speed of his assault, pushing the construct to mount a defense capable of meeting his amplified attack. He smiled as it adapted to the intensified pace. Never before had Kaluka been able to let loose against an opponent so large. He had always been the larger man, the more powerful warrior. No opponent had ever left him satisfied, every engagement a rote procedure carried out to the inevitable conclusion. It was ridiculous to think that Kaluka Unka could lose a fight against a mortal man. But this foe was no man, no mortal, and Kaluka had never felt more alive. He again increased the speed of his attack and overwhelmed the brute. He hammered his blades against the creature's tough hide, slashing it with wild abandon as the beast's eyes dimmed into darkness. It suddenly dropped to the stone floor and erupted into a cloud of dust, settling around Kaluka's feet. The Monmotavi took a knee before the remains and bowed his head, silently thanking Faldor for the gift of glorious, wanton battle. Hawk shouted an incantation and whipped her right hand in a circle above her head. Bands of crimson light constricted the elk beast's limbs and it fell to the floor. It briefly struggled against the bindings, then fell silent. The crimson lines of force began to dim as the construct's eyes brightened. Shit, thought Hawk. It's drawing power from the restraint spell. Eric lay several feet away in a pool of blood. He struggled to rise and fell again to the floor. Hawk's brow furrowed as she reduced the power in her spell, seeking to find a limit to the beast's healing ability. She dared not release her hold. They had a moment right now to strike, but it was fleeting. "Eric," she shouted, "get your ass up and finish this goddamn thing." Eric again struggled to stand. He grasped the hilt of his sword and pushed himself up, shakily rising to his feet. His damaged lungs heaved with the effort and his body cried out in pain. He saw the elk beast restrained upon the floor a short distance away. Already the creature's eyes were burning anew with power. "Are you a fucking god or not?" shouted Hawk, urging him forward. With a great bellow, the beast broke loose from the magical bonds and leapt to its feet. "Now, Eric, now!" shouted Hawk. Eric surged forward. He saw the brute draw back its limbs, readying to swing its mighty axes, but too slow for the young chosen. Eric jumped high into the air and brought his long sword down in a terrible strike, cleaving the construct in two and burying the great blade in the stone tile floor. The two halves of the creature teetered and fell to the ground, erupting into a cloud of dust. Hoke and Piri ran down the corridor. Their footfalls thundered and echoed as they raced onward. Several dozen yards ahead of them was a four-way intersection, the rendezvous point. Hoke saw Hawk and Eric come into view in the passageway beyond the rendezvous. As they neared the intersection, a dark mist began to form, obscuring the way. It coalesced into a thick fog that hugged the ground. Hoke spied movement within the murky darkness. As the fog began to dissipate, a nightmare shape took form. Several long necks rose from a wide central body, each with a serpent's head. Forked tongues flicked forth from mouths filled with long, razor-sharp teeth. It reached into the connecting corridor with thick gray tentacles, seeking to ensnare any who would venture too close. The horror lurked. Its tentacles writhed wetly across the floor and its heads gently swayed back and forth, patiently waiting for their next move, as though aware that there was no other way through. They warily crept toward the creature. Approaching from their separate vectors, they could attack it simultaneously from 3 sides, but their attack would need to be coordinated. Kaluka called instructions, and as one they attacked. Hawk and Peary cast binding spells from opposite sides, entangling the tentacles and briefly immobilizing their reach, while Kaluka, Hoke, and Eric leapt forward and mounted synchronous strikes against the snake heads. In a flash of sword strikes, the heads fell to the floor. Its necks writhed and spat dark blood. The tentacles withered and shrunk, falling away from their magical bonds. A dark mist once again shrouded the intersection, and the horror rose anew. It lashed out with its tentacles and knocked aside Eric, Hoke, and Kaluka. A thin gray tentacle ensnared Peary around his ankle and began to pull the Ka mage toward the waiting heads. Their mouths snapped and drooled, their sharp white teeth glinting in the light of the corridor. Peary quickly pulled his arms to his chest and made the sign of the 7-fingered hand. He began his chant, and the creature quickly released its hold, its tentacle blackened and smoking, burned by the protective field of the disruptive energy in Peary's spell. The horror shrieked in pain and wildly lashed its tentacles. "This one's different," shouted Hawk. "It's immobilized within the intersection. I think it's drawing its power directly from the floor beneath it. We can't kill it by draining its power." Eric pondered for a moment. "If there's no lower limit to its power, maybe it has an upper limit." Hawk nodded her head. "That might work. Without a proper focal point, an overpowered spell will unravel." Eric pushed his palms together into the sign of the 7-fingered hand. He spoke the incantation in his mind and felt the protective field take shape around his body. He caressed the fabric of the spell within his mind and pulled it around himself like a tightly bound cloak. He dropped the hand sign, but the ward held, bound into shape by his will. Eric stalked toward the waiting horror. Its tentacles recoiled as they made contact with the boundary of his protective barrier. The snakeheads hissed and lunged forward in mock attacks, but shied back as Eric continued to close upon the creature. Power began to build within the young chosen. He extended his arm. Energy crackled and scintillated around him as his right hand pierced the edge of his barrier. Focusing outward, he pushed the energy out of his palm and into the tentacled horror. The creature shrieked as black oily smoke began to rise from its burning flesh. Eric pushed harder and the energy surged, causing the horror to erupt into flames. Raising his fist high, he brought it down in a thunderous blow, striking the creature's center. It erupted in a shower of chunks of smoldering flesh that hit the floor and turned to ash. Eric looked around the intersection as the smoke began to clear. Peary pointed down the opened corridor. An arched opening could be seen in the far wall. "Either my eyes are playing tricks on me, or there's an open space beyond that arch," said the Ka mage. Kaluka motioned for silence and slowly crept forward. He knelt and peeked around the arched entryway. Just inside was a large circular room with a domed ceiling high overhead. Just beyond a low wall, he spied the Ka elder standing at the edge of a vast circular hole in the stone floor, the tomb of Faldor, the last wizard king of the Ka. The Mon Motavi motioned for silence but beckoned them forward. Once sheltered behind the low wall, they could hear Quintus's voice. He was speaking in whispered tones, his words indiscernible at their distance. Burning torches encircled the pit, lighting the domed ceiling high overhead with their flickering flames, and causing shadows to play across the walls. Only the darkness of the tomb itself resisted the light's touch. Movement near the rim of the pit drew their attention. The darkness of the tomb began to overflow onto the stones around Quintus's feet. It rose and formed into a dozen shadow assassins. They stood motionless around the pit as though awaiting instruction from their master. Quintus paid the creatures no mind as he continued speaking in hushed tones. Suddenly the Ka elder stepped forward, disappearing into the yawning void as though a great beast had swallowed him whole. Several seconds later they heard the sickening crunch of Quintus's body impacting the floor of the tomb deep below. The shadow creatures turned to smoke and dissipated, leaving only the flickering torches standing guard around the ancient tomb. "What the fuck?" said Hoke. "Did he just—" Hoke fell silent as his voice echoed off the dome ceiling far overhead. As the sound returned, the familiar timbre of the Farron's voice changed in their ears and became a seductive siren call, luring them forward. "You are so close. What you seek lies just ahead. Only a few more steps now. This is what you wanted. Step forward and take what you are owed." The echoes folded in upon one another until Eric felt as though he were drowning in a cacophony of whispers. He fought against the suggestions as they attempted to worm their way into his psyche. Kaluka was the first to step forward, followed by Hoke, Peary, and then Hawk. As though in a drunken stupor, they staggered toward the waiting pit. Eric shouted for them to stop, but his words fell silent in his throat. Reaching deep into the center of his being, he found an island of silence within the raging sea of whispers. He imagined the sound of a tolling bell, its sound waves rippling through the air around him, sweeping away the whispers like chaff upon the breeze. Opening his eyes, he saw Kaluka, Peary, and Hawk standing near the precipice, looks of horror painting their faces as they realized just how near death they had strayed. Hawk, suddenly weak in her knees, stumbled backward away from the darkened tomb. Peary offered her a steadying hand. "Wonders and horrors indeed," he said with a forced smile. He attempted to put a brave face over the terror he felt in his chest. As a poison eater, Peary was familiar with the cusp of death, but nearly meeting his end by self-defenestration had rattled him. "Are you all okay?" asked Eric as he approached. "What was that?" asked Kaluka. "A ward," said Hawk. "An ancient security system to deal with intruders. Luckily, it didn't have as much of an effect on Eric." Kaluka smiled grimly. Father was right. In opening the door, Quintus found the path to his own demise. As Eric stood upon the precipice, he remembered the words from his vision of Falder's tomb. "He waits for you there." He felt the pull in his being and knew what he needed to do. "I thought I was being drawn here to help you stop Quintus, but I was wrong. Quintus was dead the moment he entered Karasin. No, I was drawn here for him," said Eric, pointing into the depths of the tomb. "For Faldor." Thank you for listening. Be sure to like, share, and leave a 5-star review for the show. If you would like a copy of the Unscarred, please see the Amazon link in the show notes. Hardcover, paperback, and digital copies are all available right now. And if you want to email the show, hit me up at erictheunscarred@gmail.com.